Thank you, everybody, for coming to CURB's webinar, We Are Not Disposable, the Toxic Impacts of Prisons and Jails. We are really excited to have you and all of our panelists today to learn about the environmental impacts that prisons and jails have on our communities. CURB is a statewide coalition of about 75 organizations, all working to stop prison and jail spending, reduce the amount of people incarcerated, and redirect the resources into restoring the social safety net, education, health and human services, and all of the things that we know our communities we need and will thrive on. Today we'll be hearing from Laura Polito, a professor of ethnic studies and geography at the University of Oregon. We will also be hearing from Craig Gilmore, the founding member of the California Prison Moratorium Project. And finally, we will be hearing from Jada Raspberry, organizing director with Dignity and Power Now. CURB thought that this was an important webinar to share with our network because we have seen numerous jail construction proposals pop up and now are in a time where the California Department of Corrections is intending to refurbish or replace the 12 oldest prisons in California. We know that we have to make our movement stronger and really wanted to create this webinar to bridge the gaps between environmental justice organizations and anti-prison organizers. So our first panelist is Laura Polito, and I will leave it to you, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts about EJ and prison abolition. What I'm going to do today is I'm first going to talk a little bit about what is EJ, a little bit about its history, and then about points of possible intersection between EJ and prison abolition. So to begin with, would like us to start by just defining environmental justice. And I define it as an organizing framework that links environmental concerns with issues of power and justice. Next slide. Now, EJ draws on many different traditions, including civil rights, labor, native rights, mainstream environmentalism, the farm workers movement. In the U.S. in particular, it's been very heavily shaped by the civil rights movement, which is something I will elaborate on in a few minutes. Now, for some people, the idea that the poor and people of color are disproportionately impacted by pollution is kind of the essence of environmental justice. And while that certainly is true, I also think it's broader than that. To my way of thinking, there are at least 3 different legs that EJ stands on. Next slide. And those are disproportionate exposure, disparate culpability, and intersectional organizing frame. So let me talk very briefly about each of these. The first one is disproportionate exposure. Next slide. Now, the fact that the poor and non-white of the world bear the brunt of environmental problems, this has been a very central theme of the EJ movement. And in this particular slide here, what we see is this is a cumulative hazard index that was created by a colleague of mine, Manuel Pastor, when I was at USC. And basically, the green and yellow areas are represent places with the lowest hazardous indexes, whereas the places that are red and orange are the most hazardous. And if you know anything about Los Angeles demographics, you'll know right away that it's that central core part of LA, which is almost exclusively people of color. So we see a very clear geography to these hazardous kinds of patterns. And this is what we're referring to when we talk about disproportionate exposure. We can see this in pollution, access to land and resources, or access to things like clean water, as we saw in Flint, Michigan. The next important component of EJ is disparate responsibility. Now, the fact that the poor and non-white of the world have contributed the least to the current environmental crisis, they have simply lacked the money and power to create widespread environmental devastation. And this can be seen most acutely in terms of global warming. In this map here, the top of the map shows those countries that have produced the bulk of carbon emissions. And the bottom map shows those who will die from global warming in disproportionate numbers. So these are 2 very radical different representations. In the first map, what's significant here is we see the really bloated nature of the United States and parts of Northern and Western Europe. And we see the severely contracted nature of Africa and parts of Asia. The bottom map is the opposite. Here we have a very contracted depictions of the United States and Europe, and super bloated depictions of Africa and much of Asia, because that's where most of the deaths will occur. So this is really a very kind of immoral geography, if you will, right? Those who created the problem are certainly not bearing the bulk of the consequences for it. Next slide. And then the third part of environmental justice, which I think is really important, is the development of an intersectional organizing framework. EJ activists have consciously developed organizing frameworks and models that seek to integrate environmental sustainability and social justice. This includes things like attention to native rights, economic well-being, gender equality, racial justice, and conservation. Some of the most powerful examples are really coming from the global south and from native peoples across the world. So, for example, in Latin America, Buen Vivir and food sovereignty movements such as La Via Campesina, these are both really radical organizations that are asking fundamental questions about what constitutes a good life and how we should be living. And I see this is very much related to EJ and really taking them to a whole different level. Now, when we look about the history of the EJ movement, particularly here in the U.S., the origins are usually located in Warren County, North Carolina in the 1980s. And this is a really important history to understand because I think it explains much of the particularities of the U.S. environmental justice movement. Here, PCB-laced soil was being dumped on the side of the road by trucks. The community tried organizing against it. They tried to block it, and they failed. At that point, several civil rights leaders, including people like Ben Chavis, John Lewis, Walter Fauntroy, got involved. And they applied a distinctly civil rights framework to the situation, which was really a new articulation of the problem. Since then, the EJ movement has had some real successes and I think some real failures. Its greatest success, I believe, has been reframing how we think about the environment. So, for example, we now hear things about food justice, climate justice, energy justice, transit justice. That kind of framework has really, really proliferated. Now, I don't want to suggest we pursue a strategy of, quote, prison justice, but I do think it's important if we can somehow link this, think about how this concept can be applied in a productive kind of way. EJ has also been very successful at blocking new projects. EJ activists have mobilized communities and used various laws, including, for example, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. Now, one of the first examples of EJ and anti-prison work was the Mothers of East LA, who successfully blocked a prison in the East LA community in the 1980s. And this was actually a poster that was made at one of the hearings with the California Department of Corrections in the 1980s, which I thought was really, you know, a really great piece of work. We all held these little posters over our faces in response to the state representatives. However, despite these successes, I think that EJ has largely failed at getting polluters to actually reduce their pollution or reduce the actual harm that they impose on vulnerable communities, what I often call the racial gap. Now, there's many reasons for this, but a big one is that the U.S. environmental justice movement has been far too willing to accept the terrain established by the state. In many ways, it's very much a quintessentially liberal movement. And as a result of this, I think they have fallen into a trap of supporting politics and policies which really have sought to appease industry. I don't think that's what they choose to do, but they have not had a more radical orientation to begin challenging the state in an effective kind of way. Over the last several decades, we've seen many environmental rules that were simply not enforced. And now we're moving into an era when we're actually seeing the dismantling of those very rules and institutions. In February, early February, Congress proposed abolishing the EPA. There was also another piece of legislation by another senator which proposed eliminating a whole series of programs within the EPA, including the entire environmental justice program. In one line, it completely eliminates it. If you're interested in tracking what's going on, you can go to my website under my blog, and I've been trying to keep a track of every day of all the environmentally regulatory actions of the Trump administration. So it really is phenomenal what we are seeing here, the dismantling of the administrative state, in the words of Steve Bannon. Now, I think there is a potentially rich relationship between both prison abolition and environmental justice. but they have not engaged each other to the extent possible. And I think there's 3 levels in which we can conceptualize these different kinds of intersections. First, there are shared legal tools and strategies. Next slide. Craig is going to talk about a very specific example of how this worked really effectively. Now, this kind of collaboration, I think, really gets the most attention. And this is really activists using the EIR process as a vehicle to identify problems. Oftentimes, this can slow the process, force the state to devise solutions to the problem, and theoretically, if the problem is big enough and there are no viable solutions, it can be forced to abandon the project. Now, I think the strategy makes a lot of sense, but it is limited. And I really want to encourage folks to think beyond this model because it is essentially challenging the state on its own terms, which for EJ so far has been largely a losing strategy. So I think we need to strategize both inside and outside state. Next slide. The second way we can think about these connections is what I'm going to call regional ecology and environment. And here we're moving from specific legal tools and to thinking about larger flows. For example, flows of water, people, land, capital, and consciousness. Here we're asking the fundamental question, what kind of communities do we really want? So, for example, I thought it was outrageous last year that LA County was planning on building another prison in Lancaster in the midst of a drought. I mean, of course, it's outrageous that they're thinking of building another prison, period, but especially at this place and at that time. We really should be thinking or asking the questions, what else might we be doing with this land besides trying to bring in water from God knows where to incarcerate a bunch of people in it, right? Perhaps we could have created, in fact, maybe like a solar a collection of solar cells, right, and train people on how to use them and build them, right, something much more productive for the community rather than more environmental and social destruction. And the last point I would like to make is next slide, is what I call pick 2 or pick squared. And this refers to both thinking about the prison industrial complex and the pollution industrial complex together. And I'm really drawing here on the work of Danny Faber, who has developed the idea of the pollution industrial complex, which is obviously a take on the prison industrial complex. Now, there are tremendous parallels between these 2 formations, and we need to be studying them in relationship to each other and devising ways to target them both, because together they create massive social and ecological damage. How can we stop them before they act? We need to be asking the key questions. Who profits? Who pays the price? In what ways? How was the community served or not served by these various initiatives? And how can we begin challenging both the power and legitimacy of these 2 formations? So that's where I think we really need to be going and where we can have the greatest leverage. Thank you.
So now we're going to hear from Craig Gilmore, and he'll be talking about the environmental justice and the fight against prison expansion, specifically the Delano 2 campaign case study.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here, happy to be talking on our presentation with Laura Polito again. So I've been asked to talk about the Delano 2 campaign, and in particular the environmental justice aspect of that campaign. The campaign to stop construction of Delano 2 prison began soon after Democratic Governor Gray Davis was elected in the fall of '98 and lasted until the day the prison opened in 2005. Next slide, please. The campaign had 4 broad areas of struggle, which were all connected to each other in different ways. Next slide, please. There was an environmental lawsuit filed under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. The comments on the environmental impact reports, public meetings about the EIRs, etc. That was the first part. The second part was the environmental justice-inspired outreach and organizing effort based in the Southern San Joaquin Valley, and especially around Delano, that aimed to empower and mobilize rural residents to oppose prison expansion, pressuring their city councils and their Sacramento representatives. There was a statewide media campaign aimed at convincing mainstream press that another prison would be a waste of money or otherwise bad public policy. And last, there were years of legislative visits and demonstrations in Sacramento trying to keep funding for Delano II out of that year's budget, including the creation of new alliances and organizations like CURB and Education Not Incarceration. So let me give you a quick timeline of what happened when. The two main groups who led the campaign were the California Prison Moratorium Project and Critical Resistance. Prison Moratorium Project publicly launched at the big initial Critical Resistance conference in Berkeley in the fall of '98, and Critical Resistance transitioned from a conference to a movement organizing group in the months immediately following that conference, really kicking off when they hired their first employee, Rose Braz, half-time in early '99. In November '98, Gray Davis was elected governor, and in his first budget in January '99, announced plans to build another prison in Delano. At a birthday party in West Berkeley, a group of us began talking about whether we could use the state-required environmental review process to rally local opposition to the prison. We knew from Ruthie Gilmore's not yet published work that many rural towns in California wanted new prisons, expecting the payroll from the prison to boost the local economy. And we also knew from her work that these expectations were rarely, if ever, realized. In short, prisons don't help the local prison town economy. We in Prison Moratorium Project had toured the South San Joaquin Valley, talking to local activists who had successfully stopped prisons in their towns, and brought some of those rural activists to Berkeley for a little conference. And we'd worked with the United Farm Workers and a United Farm Workers intern to help stop a proposed prison in Farmersville. As we consulted with environmental attorneys, mostly Cassie Siegel from the Center for Biological Diversity, we realized that the environmental impact reports that the Department of Corrections had written were seriously flawed, and that in our collective push to get comments on the record, we had succeeded in naming a number of those errors, and suddenly began taking seriously the idea that we might file a lawsuit, an environmental lawsuit challenging the environmental review process. We began looking for lawyers who might take the case pro bono, and began fundraising for court fees for a potential case. At the same time, we were canvassing the San Joaquin Valley, talking to immigrants' rights groups, civil rights organizations, labor, women's groups, peace, and environmental justice groups. It became clear fairly quickly that the most likely allies in terms of generating local opposition in rural towns were the environmental justice groups already on the ground, who had relationships across the valley. And the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment was, and still is, based in Delano, and their staff, especially Caroline Farrell and Joe Morales, were very supportive of our campaign and became very active members of it. By late summer 2000, the campaign had picked up enough steam that the New York Times wrote an article about the difficulties California was having citing a controversial new prison in Delano. That article put our work in the spotlight of a number of other organizations, including funders, and made it possible for CR to do fundraising so that they could move their staff person to full-time, and the Prison Moratorium Project got our first $3,000 grant. By February 2001, we had pulled together an important conference in Fresno called Joining Forces, Environmental Justice and the Fight Against Prison Expansion, co-sponsored by Critical Resistance, Prison Moratorium Project, and leading environmental justice organizations, including the Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment, the Southwest Network on Environmental and Economic Justice, the United Farm Workers, West County Toxics, and others. The keynote at that conference was delivered by Juana Gutierrez, founders of the Madres del Este de Los Angeles, or Mothers of East LA. The Madres provided us a clear and powerful early example of grassroots organizing that generated successful community resistance to a new prison, an oil pipeline, and other toxins in the name of community health and safety. Professor Polito was another of the featured speakers at Joining Forces. A dozen years later, when I first met Diana, I gave her a copy of Juana's talk at that conference. We became regular attendees, next slide please, we became regular attendees at the annual California Communities Against Toxics meetings, presenting on our prison work and networking with the wider and wider net of EJ activists, rural and urban. So this is Joe Morales. This slide is Joe Morales speaking at a press conference in Sacramento. Then Senator Richard Polanco is on the far left. Rose Braz of Critical Resistance beside him, Andy Shah Karan of the SEIU in the middle, and an unknown person right behind Joe. Next slide, please. Discussions at one of those conferences highlighted the need for a regional environmental justice coalition in the San Joaquin Valley, and we presented at and immediately became members of the Central California Environmental Justice Network. At that first CCEJN conference, we showed the short documentary, A Prison in the Fields, that had been made for us by LA filmmaker Ashley Hunt, a tool we were able to use in a variety of settings across the state. Next slide, please. And next slide. Our media campaign produced two different sorts of positive reporting. Both the LA Times and the Fresno Bee published long articles that highlighted the fact that the California prison towns did not benefit from hosting a prison, which helped to undercut local support for those prison towns from both the Chamber of Commerce, representing the business interests, and voters more generally who hope to see more jobs to help out the local economy. The second tool provided by the media was that virtually every major newspaper in the state took a position against building the prison from the relatively liberal San Francisco Examiner and Sacramento Bee to the very conservative Orange County Register and San Diego Union Tribune. The Bee, in fact, published a multi-part editorial about the state's prison system that borrowed a lot of our talking points. Next slide. Helped by the fact that we won the first round of the CEQA suit and that the state was in serious budget crisis, we delayed the building and opening of the prison for over 5 years. A week before Delano 2 finally opened, the CDCR Secretary Rod Hickman said it would be the last prison built in California. It seemed as though we'd lost the battle but won the war. About a year later, CDCR announced plans for their next expansion, the Female Rehabilitative Community Correction Centers, a fight we won, but I would point out that part of that fight was that CDCR, in order to push these through, had not called them prisons, and part of our successful campaign was to rename them prisons in a media campaign. The importance of the environmental justice part of the fight can't be overestimated. It allowed us to generate opposition to prison siting in rural towns and counties where prisons were being built by tapping into already existing EJ organizations and their networks. It helped us provide tools so that those organizations could expand and organize some of the not yet organized in Delano. By focusing on the damage the prison does and widening our focus beyond the damage done to those incarcerated and their families, we were able to change common sense about the value of prisons and incarceration. A broader focus that looked not just at who was most hurt by prisons, but also at serious harm done to a wide variety of California residents, urban and rural. Governor Brown's last two budgets have included plans to renovate or replace the state's 12 original prisons, all of those built before 1965, that imprison around 40,000 people. For most of its history, when CDCR has replaced a prison, they don't get around to closing the old one. So at worst, we can look at this seemingly harmless bit of upkeep as a stealth expansion plan. But even if the old prisons were closed, we really want 40,000 new cells that will help cement the current prison population levels as the new baseline for the next couple of generations. CURB is working now to stop that plan and proposes instead to close at least some of those prisons without replacing them. And this is Dolores Huerta of the Dolores Huerta Foundation, previously of the United Farm Workers, speaking in Delano across the street from Delano 2 at the protest the day the prison opened. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Craig. We will now move into our next presenter, Jada Raspberry.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for being on with us. My name is Jada Raspberry, and I'm organizing director with Dignity and Power Now. And we are a social justice organization who fight to end mass incarceration in Los Angeles County jails, and we fight to tear down the prison system. We also fight to restore dignity in formerly incarcerated people, their families, as well as in our communities. My story starts out in Valley State Prison for Women. I did a total of 6 years from 2006 to 2012 inside of the facility, so therefore I know firsthand about what's happening inside. I myself went through a lot while I was inside. I witnessed a lot of things. I went through a lot of stuff, mainly a lot of reproductive and human rights violations. And when I came home, I wanted to fight. Okay. So with that, my story starts off, like I said, inside Valley State Prison. And while I was inside, I contracted a kidney infection. And this went on for about 3 months. It went untreated. It started off maybe as something smaller, and it grew into something much, much bigger. I remember at one point before I was diagnosed with the kidney infection that the institution sent out letters to all of our units stating that the level of arsenic in the water wasn't hazardous to our health, right? When the water that came out of our faucets it looked like squirt soda. It sizzled. You had to, let the water run inside of your cup, and you had to, wait until, the sizzling and the cloudiness went away before you could drink it. So, you make a cup of water and you could drink it 3 minutes later. From then, so I put in a copay. I go to the medical staff, and I'm telling them about the situation that I'm having. Okay, I'm having back pain, I'm having side pain, lower abdominal pain. It was just really, really bad. And upon me going to the medical, the clinic on our yard, I was told that, I was a young woman and my body was, I was at childbearing age and my body wanted to be pregnant. So that was their reason for me having all of the back pains and the stomach pains and the side pains and urinating. My urine actually looked like the water that was coming out of the faucet. I would give them a urine sample of my urine that looked like squirt soda, and it sizzled like it too. So it was really, really bad. I was just to the point where I almost died in Valley State Prison. So before I was able to actually get treated, my roommates called, medical emergency, and when the medical staff came, my heart rate was accelerated, everything was just, blood pressure was high. I was on my way out the door. Like, that prison almost killed me. So they figured out, once I got to the infirmary, it was a kidney infection that had gone on for a long time. And the doctor that was on call was actually the doctor who told me that, my body was at childbearing age and, it wanted to be pregnant. So I say that to say that I'm here today because I'm a fighter, okay? And I'm the voice for, the voiceless. I was once someone with no voice, and now I'm using my voice for the good. And I joined Dignity and Power Now in 2014, and I've been organizing with this organization for 2.5 years now. And we are an organization, like I said, who fights to end mass incarceration. And we have 2 campaigns and 6 projects. One of the campaigns that we work with CURB on is through our No More Jail campaign. So that campaign, next slide. That campaign is started in 2016. Like 10 years ago. I'm sorry, like 10 years ago. Where the county they propose to build 2 new jails, right? So they want to tear down Men's Central and rebuild that to make it more mental health friendly, but also move the women 70 miles away to Lancaster. And we're saying no, okay? That just can't happen. We need alternatives, okay, for women who are, placed in these situations, and when they're coming home from jails and prisons, we need somewhere for them to go. So all this money being placed inside of building this 70-mile away jail, this jail that's 70 miles away, is really ridiculous. So what we did to stop that is we organized individuals and organizations, and we developed the We Are Not Disposable report, which I assume folks have already read or are familiar with. And we shifted public opinion, by engaging in the environmental impact process and through direct action. Next slide. Some of the successes that we have, we've had are we've organized groups such as Critical Resistance LA. They led an effort to support a coalition in Lancaster. We had the Youth Justice Coalition organized pre-LA students, and we also shifted public opinion, meaning we had 10 mainstream and alternative media outlets cover the story, which was brilliant. Next slide. Another success of ours was we delayed the EIR process by getting 2 additional community meetings scheduled, which one was held in Lancaster and another, well, one was held in Lancaster and the other one was here in Los Angeles, I believe. Yes, so we had those 2 meetings scheduled, and part of the draft EIR was translated to Spanish, so folks who spoke Spanish could also read the report and know what was going on. We also voted to, the vote was stalled on the final EIR, and we shut down the Board of Supervisors through direct action. Next slide. Our main environmental and public health arguments, the picture that you're seeing right now is someone who contracted valley fever. So the impact of valley fever is basic. Okay, so there's a huge, valley fever is terrible. Okay, people die from valley fever. And the drought and accessibility to water in a desert-like region is terrible. Okay, so we're already in a drought. The soil is contaminated. So therefore, why would you build something where you're trying to house something where people won't be safe, where people won't get clean water, where the air quality sucks? And the location was the former military base, so you can imagine how toxic the land is. Some challenges that we faced were, as the Board of Supervisors, next slide, yes. Some challenges that we faced were, as the Board of Supervisors, they approved the final EIR, but it's difficult to engage, other EJ organizations. And if built, if this jail is built, the coalition needs to monitor these public health issues, because all of these things that I've named and that I just went through are public health issues. So, yeah, that's my piece.
Thank you so much, Jada. We really appreciate you sharing your story and sharing the amazing work that you're participating in Los Angeles, along with several of our member organizations. Okay, so again, if you have any questions, please send them through the questions panel, and we'll move into that in a little bit. What's next for EJ organizations and for organizations at large and individuals that want to tackle mass incarceration? Specifically for EJ orgs, we are asking that you endorse the We Are Not Disposable report. This is as a supplemental item on the RSVP document that you sent. You'll be able to access that report through the service and also on the CURB website on curbprisonspending.org. We're also asking that you support the 12 Prison Campaign. So again, like Jada was saying, and Craig and Laura, there are several environmental concerns in these facilities. And CURB will be engaging in a fight to think about the closure of prisons that have created environmental harms for our communities and also created traumatic experiences that our communities are now trying to heal from. We would love if you can connect with us for coalition building opportunities. There will be several ways for you to engage in the 12 Prison Campaign, and we're open and interested in talking through those ways with environmental justice organizations that are interested in this. Please share these resources with your colleagues, and we're also open to organizing a presentation like this or a version of it for your organizations or individuals that you're in coalition with. So please keep us posted and reach out to us on curbprisonspending.org, and we can connect you to all of our presenters today and to a lot of the amazing resources that we have available for you all. So now we will jump into questions and answers. I'm going to be fielding a few questions. We will be emailing you all the recording of this webinar, so that be on the lookout for an email for us. I know that from us. That's a question that I'm getting in the box right now. And if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the questions box, and I will be fielding it to our panelists. So the first question: has there been any conversations about jobs for people in the areas where new prisons are proposed? Instead of prisons, are there conversations about community-based spaces where people can be held for their sentences in a more supportive environment? I'm going to leave this question first to Craig and then to Jada. So Craig, can you start off maybe by answering if there have been conversations about jobs for people in the areas where new prisons are being proposed?
Yeah. The first thing to say is that the people in prison towns don't get the jobs in the prisons that go in their towns. So, for example, Delano has 3 prisons now. Before they had their first prison, they had an unemployment rate of 30%. A year after the 3rd prison opened, they still had an unemployment rate of 30%. The people who work in that prison commute to the prison. They don't live there. They're not people who already lived in Delano and are unemployed. They don't spend money there except, at McDonald's coming and going out of town. During the Delano 2 campaign, we talked to the mayor of Delano, Arturo Madrid, and we said to him, we kind of laid this out for him and said, your people here are going to get a handful of jobs. And he kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, shit, I got 30% unemployment here. I've got more than half of the people in Delano are living in poverty. A handful of jobs is better than no jobs at all. And I can't go to Sacramento and say, give me something other than a prison. We've tried that. They're only offering us prisons. Prisons are nothing. And so for me, having a prison here is better than having nothing here. So there have been conversations in the prison abolitionist movement and in the anti-prison movement more generally about what sorts of alternatives there might be to incarceration. But typically those don't involve shipping people from Los Angeles to Delano for some alternative program, right? It's keeping people in Los Angeles. So there's kind of 2 separate things. There's what sorts of jobs might be generated if we were hiring more social workers, if we built more public housing, et cetera, in prison sending communities. And then there's what sorts of things might happen in rural towns where prisons are built, which are really both places need jobs, but 2 separate kinds of jobs programs, I think, would fulfill those needs.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig, for that answer. Just if there's anything to add, Jada, instead of prisons, are there conversations about community-based spaces where people can be held for their sentences in a more supportive environment?
Yes, right now we're in conversation about, formerly incarcerated people creating their own programs, which would help support people coming home from inside. So right now we're in conversation about that.
Thank you. I think that there's also, and we can share this report from the Sentencing Project, where there's also conversations about repurposing prisons that have happened in several different states. So this has happened in New York and also in Pennsylvania. They're just we're just starting the conversation about closing 2 prisons because of fiscal issues. So this is also something we can add to the resources that you all can see. So the next question, so we are not only imprisoning people, but actually killing them by poisoning them. Who do we hold accountable for killing those incarcerated? Is that something that Jada would like to take on, or Craig?
Yeah, I can. I think so. We are not only imprisoning people, but actually killing them by poisoning them. Who do we hold accountable for killing those incarcerated? I would say the Office of Inspector General. Right now, we have the Office of Inspector General who just sits up there. He's supposed to investigate, and he is supposed to hold folks accountable when things are happening, such as the building of this new jail and people being poisoned inside. The staff needs to be held accountable for what's happening right now. Right now, people are just, going to work and, like you say, killing us, and that's not right. So we need public health solutions right now. Yeah, I would say we need public health solutions.
Thank you, Jada. And there is an Office of the Inspector General at the state level and in most local counties. So we know Los Angeles County has an Office of the Inspector General to address jail issues, and the state has one to address prison issues. And I think the other piece is that a part of our advocacy is going to talk to elected officials, senators, and assembly members about the issues that people are experiencing inside of these prisons. So that's another way to get engaged and get involved. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing a comment that I just kind of want to share with everybody. I am a doctor in Northern California, part of HP. Myself and a few members of our organization are going to SAC Lobby Day to advocate for healthcare and would love to help the cause. Looking for next steps. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for sharing that. We're really interested in getting connected with you about that possibility. We will also be lobbying in Sacramento, and if folks on this webinar are interested in learning how to participate in that and getting trained to go and lobby for criminal justice issues and the connection to environmental and health justice issues, please visit our website, curbprisonspending.org, and you can get in contact with us and we can follow up with you. So I have another pretty interesting question here. Can you speak to language and moves from corrections officials and developers towards greening prisons? Laura and Craig, maybe you all can take on that question.
I'm not clear about the language of developers.
Yeah, it's kind of this new move that corrections officials and developers are taking on as they build new prisons and jails. What we've heard is that a lot of times these new prisons and jails will be green friendly, they'll be LEED certified. If you can talk a little bit about that development.
Well, I think that's like obviously really problematic. And I'm thinking about kind of like some of the struggles of transgender and, women fighting against prisons when they come back and offer like boutique prisons, right? This is perfect for, women, or this is perfect for transgendered individuals. So now we're having like the whole green thing, right? And so that's why I think it's really important to develop a much more deep and radical critique that does not get kind of co-opted into, yes, we just want like better prisons, right? Or, the idea like of what some people might talk about, like quote, quote, prison justice, right? But go into a much deeper kind of analysis and that goes to the point of like, how do we, what do we really want for our communities? So we get out of that, which isn't very helpful, but it's really bad. I know there was a student at Oregon, her name was Jewel, and she was doing a whole thesis on this about the ways in which prisons were using like gardening programs and other kinds of green strategies to, make themselves more acceptable and to communities. I think it's a really great area to mobilize around.
The other thing I would add, I guess.
Okay, go ahead.
The other thing I would add to what Laura said is that, we know that for every year someone spends in prison, it takes 2 years off their life, right? But the insurance companies know that, health professionals know that. And so, I think one of the things that we are still challenged to articulate as well as we might is that incarceration itself is an environmental hazard. That even if, like at Valley State, Jada told the story of the horrible, horrible water that they had there. But, if they cleaned the water up at Valley State, or if the water had been cleaned when Jada was in Valley State, there would still have been sexual harassment and sexual violence by guards. There would still have been separation from family. There would have been the things that shorten life for people in prison aren't simply environmental concerns narrowly understood. bad air or bad water or bad food. The whole environment of incarceration is toxic, and we need to be able to articulate that, I think, more powerfully than we have, in order to say we don't want greener prisons. If you want to green people's lives, keep them out of prison in the first place.
This question is for you, Craig. Do you have resources or examples of campaigns opposing environmentally harmful industries like power plants, etc., being built next to prisons? I'm interested in the health of incarcerated people as an EJ community and what arguments can be made during a CEQA EIS process.
In California, the South San Joaquin Valley is a big region which has become an environmental justice nightmare. I mean, there are waste disposal incinerators, there's toxic dumping, there's fracking, there are prisons. So these toxic industries are sited across like a big 4 or 5 county region. So they're not sited next to each other in the sense of across the street from each other or half a mile away, but they're sited in the same, they're all sited in the South San Joaquin Valley. And the environmental justice networks that we plugged into as part of the Delano 2 fight were created by the work of organizations, the Center on Race, Poverty, Environment, and Green Action, who helped generate local responses to toxic dumping in places like Kettleman City or bad water in southern Tulare County, or toxic drift of insecticides in Kern and Tulare County. So there were these local organizations fighting those very local fights that these bigger organizations helped network with each other. And we completely depended on those networks and the people in those organizations for the local organizing we did in the Valley. So it's the specific relationship of external generation of toxics to the prison itself was something of a secondary issue at that point, except in the case of water quality, which was a couple of the organizations that did water quality issues pointed out that their bad water was coming from the same place that the water for the Delano prison was going to come from.
Thank you. And I think to answer the other question, for the environmental justice community that's interested in the health of incarcerated people and what arguments could be made, I think that is something that we attempted to do in the Los Angeles fight against the proposed women's jail. We knew that the land that the jail is proposed to be built on is toxic land because it was a previous military base. We also knew through our research and by connecting to environmental justice experts that particular area is the intensity of valley fever has actually increased. And valley fever is an airborne disease that is picked up from the spores in the ground. Many people could be susceptible to valley fever if they have lower immune systems. And we know in the Antelope Valley there are huge cases of valley fever, and that's increasing rapidly. So in order to really focus on the health of incarcerated people, we really focused on the valley fever issue and how that would impact anybody that was incarcerated, imprisoned in that particular prison. That is still something that we're monitoring, even though the LA Board of Supervisors passed the final environmental impact report, knowing that there could be this issue of valley fever. We are now kind of taking a public health approach, and we'll have to be monitoring the Department of Public Health and the Sheriff's Department to make sure that any issues regarding valley fever in this jail, once it's built, are addressed. So that is kind of one of the issues that we worked on.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, Diana, is that well, one of the things we did, not entirely successfully, when we were filing comments on the environmental impact reports, was we were inspired by the fact that the environmental justice movement has pushed very hard and expanded the notion of what environmental protection means. And that fight, we believe, is not over. So, you know, we put comments in as part of our comments on the EIRs, we talked about things like the costs of taking a parent out of a household, the cost. Well, most of the costs are hard to quantify in narrow environmental terms. I mean, we know what the costs are, but saying it doesn't increase carbon emissions, for example. But we were trying then to push for a notion of environmental harm that might include incarceration itself as an environmental harm, or policing as an environmental harm. That's something I think which we didn't change the law. The courts didn't take any of that stuff seriously. But I think you know, that we need, especially in the light of Black Lives Matter has happened since the Delano 2 campaign, and I think now there's a real case that could be made publicly for policing as a public health problem. So pushing the boundaries of what counts as environmental harm to include things that aren't simply chemical toxins, but also social, economic, and political toxins as well.
Definitely. Thanks for adding that, Craig. And I think CURB and its members would definitely be happy to work with the EJ community to figure out how we could press those concerns even further.
Great.
Okay. Next question. In Appalachian coal fields, there is an emerging conversation about what the next economic driver for the region might be. While many state and industry actors claim that prisons are the solution, others are calling for investment to create jobs in the sustainable energy sector. Are there comparable initiatives in California, and what other sectors have been proposed in place of prison employment for depressed communities?
The problem in prison communities of the South San Joaquin Valley has been, it was then and it is now, the power of big ag, agribusiness, who really control the politics of that region. They don't want more jobs in that region at higher pay levels that will provide competition for farm workers who've settled in the valley. So even though the local economies are massively depressed, Tulare County, for example, has one of the highest poverty rates in the country. Kings and Kern County are massively poor, incredibly polluted. The powers that be in those counties don't want economic development. They're very happy to have unemployment in the 20s and even into the 30%, because it means they have cheap labor in their fields. So there's not a local push to generate, there's not a significant local push to generate alternatives to prisons as ways of cutting unemployment and providing decent wage jobs for local residents. And indeed, there's not much of a push to put prisons there because increasingly people in the town realize that the jobs aren't going to go to local residents, and we help destroy that myth in the valley, and more generally in California. So, I mean, there is some development, but it's mostly not locally driven. So the South San Joaquin Valley, for example, there are a lot of warehouses that are going in as part of the kind of massive extension out of the Los Angeles-San Pedro port system to move Asian-produced goods, you know, into the rail system and truck system of the United States. But that's not a locally driven process. It's driven from Los Angeles.
Okay, so we are at 12:58, and we did plan to stop this webinar at 1 o'clock. So I know that there are a lot of other questions and kind of resources being circulated through the questions tab right now. We will keep track of those questions and see if our panelists have any answers to some of those questions that we can send your way. Along with the recording. So be on the lookout for the recording, for additional resources that people are requesting through this questions tab, and also any answers to the questions that you've asked so far. Again, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists, all of the participants, and all of our collaborators. You can see the list of all of the amazing organizations and individuals that have supported pulling together the report and this webinar. Again, thanks for joining CURB, and you can visit curbprisonspending.org to learn more and get more connected to these resources. We look forward to continuing to build and work with you. And again, thank you so much for joining today.